Aramaic is a Semitic language which has been spoken in some form for around 3,000 years in the central Middle East. Over the millennia it's existed in a number of distinct stages, and today has become a small family of individual languages. This fracturing began after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire in the late 4th century BC, and the Eastern and Western dialects that developed have now become the Eastern and Western language groups. Around the turn of the first millennium, the Western Galilean dialect was spoken in Galilee, which is believed to have been the native language of Jesus. The language has been written in a number of different scripts in its time, but today mainly uses the Hebrew script, which was originally a modified form of an Aramaic system, and the Syriac script, a cursive form mainly used by Christian speakers. The Mandaic language also uses its own system. Baric is a pidgin language spoken in northern Nigeria. This means it doesn't have any native speakers, and has developed due to the influence and contact between many different languages which speakers don't share. It's a military language, having developed in the army's barracks throughout the 20th century. While many Pidgin and Creole languages around the world use European languages as their bases, Baric retains its African roots, using the Afro-Asiatic Hausa language as the main source of its vocabulary and grammar, though it has diverse influences due to the varied backgrounds of its speakers. Despite being spoken in Indonesia, Chia is one of just 3 languages in the world to be written using the Korean Hangul alphabet. The other 2 are Korean and Jeju, a pair of closely related Koreanic languages. Chia, on the other hand, is Austronesian and completely unrelated to the others. The project to use the Korean script began in 2009, with the intention to replace the previous mix of Latin and Arabic scripts. While the official initiative was discontinued in 2012, it has still seen a fair amount of attention and use by local teachers, and in 2022 the first Chia dictionary was published, using Hangul to write the language. Dahalo is a Cushitic Afro-Asiatic language spoken by about 580 people on the coast of Kenya. It's highly endangered, with no remaining child speakers, and all adult speakers also being bilingual in other languages of the region. It has a huge number of sounds, around 62 consonants by some accounts, and this number includes 4 clicks, which are extremely rare outside of southern Africa, and may reflect a shift by the speakers from an earlier lost language. It also uses a number of other rare sounds, and makes several distinctions found in almost no other language. In the first of this series of videos, I discussed Romani, a group of languages spoken by the Romani people across Europe. One of these languages is Eromincela, which developed from the mixing of the Calderash Romani dialects and the Basque language of France and Spain. In the 15th century, a group of the Romani arrived to the region, where they settled down into Basque culture and learned the language. This then affected their own language they'd brought with them, giving rise to Eromincela. Much of the language is lexically based on Romani, but often adds Basque suffixes and grammatical elements. Today there are around 1,000 speakers, who are almost all elderly, making the language vulnerable to extinction. In the north there are children learning the language, but loss in the younger generations of the south may lead to the language's death sometime in the future. Finnish Sign is a language used by around 5,000 natives. although this count is very uncertain, due to mixed attitudes and policies in the past. Like all sign languages, it's unrelated to the spoken mode, having its own distinct grammar, word order and characteristics. It's actually part of the Swedish Sign family, having split off from Swedish Sign Language in the mid-1800s. Also part of the family are Portuguese Sign and Eritrean Sign, which both developed in schools set up by Swedish and Finnish missionaries, hence why such distant places use such closely related languages. There's also a Finnish-Swedish Sign Language, which is fairly intelligible to Finnish signers, but different enough to be distinct. Gulla is an English-based Creole language spoken in coastal areas of the southeastern US. It's been proposed as the language from which African American vernacular English developed, although this view is not universally held. It developed in slave populations of the region during the 18th and 19th centuries, from a mix of dialectal English and their native African languages. Hundreds of these African influences still exist in the language today, which can be traced back to many languages of Western Africa, such as Fula, Mende, Vai, and Igbo. The influences still exist so strongly because of the isolation historical speakers existed in for much of their enslavement on rural plantations. They also retain a unique culture, with features of both African and American traditions. Another language of the US is Hawaiian, which is spoken by just 2,000 people, around 10% of the population of the archipelago. It's an Austronesian language, related to Malay, Maori and Tagalog. The population's proficiency in the language has been in slow decline since the arrival of European and American explorers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This was expedited by events following the 1893 coup against Queen Liliuokalani, when laws were passed mandating use of English in schools. Today, the only place where it sees majority use is on Hawaii's westernmost island of Niihau, although there has been some recent awareness and interest in the language, with some schools opening and new programs and resources created. It is, however, still considered critically endangered. Iraku is the language of about 600,000 people of northeastern Tanzania. It's a Cushitic language, part of the larger Afro-Asiatic family, so distantly related to Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic and Egyptian. Like many of these languages, it uses grammatical gender, having 3 of them. For many, if not most words, a different gender is used in the plural compared to the singular. For instance, in the singular, the word for cliff is masculine, so takes the same verb marking as he. In the plural, however, it's feminine, so takes the same marking as she. The effects of gender are observable on verbs, and also on a special marker added to nouns when they're used with modifiers. Back in the US now, Jemez is a language spoken by 3,000 people in the state of New Mexico. This language has a very interesting system of marking number on its nouns. In English we have 2 numbers, the singular and the plural, and we distinguish these by marking the plural with a suffix. In Jemez there are 3 numbers, the 2 of English and a dual used for 2 things. However, between these 3 there's only 1 suffix. Different classes of nouns use this suffix for different numbers, depending on which number is assumed to be the default for that class. This system is called inverse number, and is very rare across languages. Kobal is a language spoken by somewhere between 5 and 7.5 million people worldwide, but with the largest concentration in Algeria. It's the country's second most spoken language, and is co-official with Arabic, the language of the majority. It's a Berber language, part of the larger Afro-Asiatic family. Until the 6th century, many of the Berber languages, including Kobal, wrote in the Tifinagh script, but at this time Latin became the main administrative language of the region, so Tifinagh fell out of use. Some languages have since revived it, but Kobal only commonly uses it in Morocco, with Latin more common in Algeria. Lingala is a Creole language spoken across Central Africa, but particularly in the two Congos, having developed around parts of the Congo River. In the early 1880s, Europeans arrived to the area to set up settlements, and encountered the local Bangi-speaking population. They tried to learn the Bangi language, but only to an extent, and the language ended up developing into a new Creole variety. This language, which they called Bangala, was introduced into the new settlements, where it was taken up by many of the locals. Later on, European missionaries attempted to decreolize and enlarge it. This new form they called Lingala, which continues to be spoken by around 60 million people today. Now extinct, the Amabam language was a Pama-Nyungan language, spoken in a small area west of the Australian city of Cairns, in the state of Queensland. It went extinct in 1979, with the death of its last speaker, Alec Chalk. Before this happened, though, the linguist R.M.W. Dixon did some work on documenting the language. During the documentation process, Dixon famously asked a speaker for the Amabam word for dog, to which he got the answer, dog. While he assumed at first he had been misunderstood, this is actually the translation, by complete coincidence. Cognates can be found in nearby languages, and can be traced back to a protoform completely independent of English. Today there are three main languages of Scotland: English, Scots and Scottish Gaelic. In the past, however, there was another, Norn, which was spoken on the northerly isles of Orkney and Shetland. This language was a relic of the Viking invasions of the 9th century, being a North Germanic language related to Norwegian. Decline of the language likely began with the introduction of Scots, when the islands came under Scottish control in the late 1300s. It still survived in the 18th century, however, and may possibly have existed until the 19th or even 20th centuries. Very little of it remains today, although it sees rare use in naming or ceremonial functions, and there is a small revival movement, although this faces debates around which stage of the language should be revived, and how much Scots influence should be accepted. Oromo is a language spoken by around 30 to 40 million people around the world, but particularly in and around Ethiopia and into Kenya. It's among the most spoken languages of Ethiopia and is one of the country's 5 official languages. It's also the 3rd or 4th most spoken language in the whole of Africa. It's a member of the Cushitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic family, making it related to other Horn African languages, like Somali, Beja, Afar and Dahalo, and more distantly to Aramaic, Kobal and Coptic. Like other closely related languages, Oromo is a pitch accent language, where it uses tone only on one stressed syllable. This is a feature of several other languages worldwide, such as Ancient Greek, Japanese, Swedish and Punjabi, and is less complex than the systems found across much of the rest of Africa. Pingalap is an atoll in the Pacific country of Micronesia. Pingalapese is the indigenous language of this island, although only a fraction of the 4,500 native speakers actually live there. The language is predominantly spoken, as although a writing system does exist for the language, it's not taught in schools, and is only spoken in less formal settings. The language is particularly noteworthy for its complex numeral system, where the numbers below 10 each have 5 different forms, depending on the nature of the noun used. For instance, the word for the number 8 is welabas when describing a long noun, like a tree, but is welemen for an animate noun, like a person or animal. Kobal is the Mayan language of around 180,000 people in Guatemala and southern Mexico. Like other Mayan languages, it uses a base 20 numeral system, meaning that numbers run up to 20 before starting to count back up from 1 again. This is different to English, which is base 10. In English we express 55 as 50 or 5 tens, add 5, while Kobal expresses it as 2 20s, add 15. The language also uses classifiers, which fill a function similar to Pingalapese's numerals, where nouns require one of a number of additional words in certain situations, such as with numerals. The choice of classifier word is based on meaning, again similar to Pingalapese. Sometimes considered a dialect of Ukrainian, Rusin is a language or variety spoken in a number of Eastern European countries, but with particular concentrations in Slovakia, Serbia and Poland. It's a member of the East Slavic branch of languages, which also contains Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian. Along with Ukrainian and Belarusian, it descends from the Ruthenian language, which was spoken until the 18th century, at which point it began to diverge into those forms spoken today. The first written Rusin documents appeared in the mid-1700s, and standardization began in the 1800s. Today there are a number of standardized forms and dialects, although probably the main one is Prešov Rusin, which is used in Slovakia. Svan is the language of around 30,000 people in the province of Svaneti, along the northwestern border of Georgia. It's one of just 4 members of the Kartvelian family of languages, with the others being Georgian, Mingrelian and Laz. Svan comprises its own separate branch of the family, the other 3 being grouped together under the Georgian Zan branch, and this primary division thought to have taken place around the 19th century BC. Svan has a simpler case system than its sisters, and differs in a number of other respects as well, such as the phonology. While it is similar to other Caucasian languages in having a lot of consonants, Svan also has quite a lot of vowels, having 18, which is far more than the 5 of its sister Georgian. Tulugu is a south-central Dravidian language spoken in India by almost 100 million people. It's the 14th most spoken language in the world, and the most spoken Dravidian language, as well as being one of India's 6 classical languages. It has a literary history, dating back to the earliest inscriptions over 2,000 years ago. As with many major languages of India, Telugu writes using its own script, the Telugu Abugida, which developed around the start of the 2nd millennium, from an earlier form used to write the related Kannada language. In an Abugida script, the main letters are consonants, and vowels are added on as diacritics. This is different to both alphabets, where consonants and vowels have equal status as letters, and abjads, where only consonants are full letters, and vowel diacritics are either optional or absent. Ubek is an extinct language which was spoken in Caucasian Russia until 1992, when Tevfik Esench, the last fluent native speaker, died. The language was previously thought to have the most consonants of any in the world, until this title was found to belong instead to the Southern African language Tar, although Ubek still retains this position if Tar's innumerous click consonants are excluded. The high consonant count is common in languages of the Caucasus, and as with a few other languages of the region, Ubek didn't require as many vowels to make the necessary contrasts, so distinguished only 2. Veda is a language indigenous to Sri Lanka, which is spoken today by perhaps a couple of hundred people. Its status was long uncertain, with experts disagreeing on whether it's a dialect of Sinhalese or a mixed language. In around the 5th century BC, Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples arrived on the island and came into contact with the indigenous inhabitants. This subjected their language to great change, amplified by later waves of migration, also including Dravidians such as Tamils. The result was Veda, which is now considered a creole of the Indo-Aryan Sinhalese and the lost indigenous tongue. Today much of the language resembles Sinhalese, but it retains a number of grammatical features not found in neighbouring languages. Vimesauris is the rarest and most endangered member of the Germanic language family. It's spoken by about 20 people in the small Polish town of Wilemowice, almost all of which are bilingual and elderly, meaning the language is likely close to extinction. It's descended from Middle High German, but has had a very strong influence from Polish, and some too from English, Dutch, German and Low German. Its writing system is derived from that of Polish. The modern version of this was created by native speaker Józef Gara, who was very active in the language, writing poems, collecting old songs, and teaching the language in the local primary school. Until the early 20th century, over half the population of the town spoke the language, but today less than 1% are native. Savant is the language of about 9,600 people in mid-western Brazil. It's notable for having an object-subject-verb word order, which is the rarest arrangement of words across languages. Its phonology is also unusual, having no phonemic nasals, no velar consonants, and more vowels than consonants. There exists a lot of allophony in its consonant system, however, with most sounds varying in their pronunciations depending on context. Its morphology and syntax are also rather complex, depending a great deal on the case of relevant arguments. The language is still going strong, with speakers representing all parts of society, young and old, and speakers generally look favourably upon it rather than scorning it, as the speakers of many other endangered languages do. Yuchi is a language isolate of the US state of Oklahoma. In 2021, the last native speaker, Maxine Wildcat Barnett, died, although there are still a dozen second language speakers and active efforts to revitalise the language. Originally, the language was spoken further east in the state of Tennessee, but speakers were forced out of their homeland in the 1830s as per government policy. There's no single official way to write the language, although the one used by the Yuchi Language Project is fairly common, utilising capitals and symbols in addition to diacritics to show the many sounds of the language. Jang is a grouping of languages in the Kradai family, which has 16 million speakers across about 16 separate language varieties. They share the prestige variety of Standard Jang, which was created from a mixture of dialects, but mainly based on the northern Shuangqiao variety. For over 1,000 years, the languages have been written using the Sawn-Dip script, which is based on Chinese writing, but also contains a number of other characters. Standard Jang is generally written in a Latin alphabet, which uses letters like H, J, Q and X to mark the language's tones, as these are not otherwise used in the language. Several other scripts have also occasionally been employed, but have never seen much use.